Yeah, recording.
Okay, then.
Yeah.
Well, good afternoon. Since I'm in Istanbul, I said good afternoon, but it depends on where you are. Since we are on webinar, maybe it's morning or evening for you, but my best wishes from this side as we are starting. Welcome to the first webinar of UNIC. UNIC is the abbreviation of European University of Post-Industrial Cities. This is a newly established institution under the European Universities Program of Erasmus Plus scheme of European Commission. My name is Ahmet İçduygu. I'm the director of the Migration Research Center at Koç University, Istanbul, in the same university. I'm the faculty member. And I will be moderating this webinar entitled Superdiversity and Inclusion in Higher Education Concepts and Practices. This webinar has been organized by Migration Research Center at Koç University, collaborating with the other UNIC partner universities. Koç University is one of the 8 universities of UNIC. Putting it very briefly, UNIC is composed of 8 universities in Europe. These 8 universities came together and established UNIC with the aim of increasing mobility and inclusion for social impact. In fact, we will have some presentation about the detail of the UNIC within a few seconds. These 8 universities are Erasmus University Rotterdam, Koç University, Ruhr University Bochum, University College Cork, University Deusto, University of Liège, University of Oulu, and University of Zagreb. Before introducing the main concept of this webinar today, this is organized with the title of Superdiversity and Inclusion in Higher Education. And before going into the panel discussion by the 3 distinguished scholars, I'd like to invite Professor Peter Scholten of the Erasmus University Rotterdam to have his introductory remarks. In fact, Peter is the architect of the origin of this idea of UNIC. Now he is the coordinator of the whole UNIC operations. Before giving the floor to him, actually, I'd like to briefly introduce Peter. He's a professor of public administration in the governance of migration and diversity at the Erasmus University of Rotterdam. His research focuses on, amongst others, on governance of migration-related diversity, multi-level governance. He's director of IMISCO, as some of you know that the IMISCO is the Europe's largest academic research network on migration, integration, and social cohesion. Peter is also editor of the journal Comparative Migration Studies. And as of 2020, as already I mentioned, that he's the coordinator of European University of Post-Industrial Cities, which is UNIC. So, Peter, can I invite you just to have your remarks? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ahmet, for this very nice, kind introduction. And I'm delighted and excited that we today, under the leadership University, and with participation of some of the other UNIC partners, we are starting our first European tour with the UNIC seminar series. And as it's the main ambition of this series to engage in dialogue amongst our 8 universities on our joint identity and on the challenges that we have in common, I wanted to start by taking a step back and briefly highlight, for those who aren't aware of it yet, what UNIC actually is and why UNIC is there and what you can also expect in the future in terms of ambitions and implications for our universities. So UNIC stands for the European University of Post-Industrial Cities. And what we aim to do is to unlock a European learning, working and researching experience for students, staff and scholars from the 8 universities which Ahmet has already kindly introduced. And why these 8 universities from these different EU countries? Well, that's because they are, well, we are previous research collaboration. We also bring some of the material to the table on that today. Because we share a common identity as unique universities. We all, as universities, we all play a leading role in various post-industrial transitions in the cities in which we are situated. So a lot of the post-industrial revival of the cities involves our universities, our research, the leaders that we are training through our education. They are shaping the future of our cities. So we all are impact-oriented universities for this. And in fact, our universities, most of our universities, were even established with this purpose of bringing higher education to post-industrial urban areas, to the children of mine workers, industrial workers, port workers, bringing also migrant workers from across our member countries of UNIC. So this is the common identity that we have in UNIC. And that also brings us to the topic of today. It brings strong focus in UNIC on impact and on inclusion. So also, if you look in terms of talking about inclusion, when you look at our universities, our university students, but also our staff and our researchers, very much reflect this diversity that is typical for post-industrial cities. And so a lot of diversity which is related to migratory backgrounds, so migration-related diversity, but also more in general diversity in terms of class positions and all other sorts of intersectionalities. And in UNIC, we describe the students, staff, and scholars with the term non-traditional students, scholars, or staff, which includes people with a migration background, but also others who come from generations, from families where nobody has ever gone to a university, the so-called first-generation students or first-generation staff, of which many are also involved in UNIC, who are themselves first-generation staff. So this makes it even more important for our universities to set a high standard within Europe and the European higher education area when it comes to inclusion, but also for ourselves. We are not going to claim here today that our universities are already the role models that are going to say to the other universities how to do that. That's of course not the case. And so we have to work hard to make our universities inclusive, work hard to make our cities inclusive. But if we do that successfully, then we can really bring something that we can be very proud of. Having a lot of non-traditional students, staff, and scholars is not a problem. It's typical for the cities where we're in, and it's a capacity, it's a resource, it's a form of that we bring to UNIC and to our 8 universities. So in terms of what we will be doing then in the near future, let me be very brief on that. We will be seeing primarily 3 different types of activities. One is our inter-university campus, where we will be promoting mobility between students from our 8 universities, but also staff and scholars, and with a particular attention to mobility of non-traditional students, staff, and scholars. Secondly, and today's seminar relates directly to this part of UNIC, our Superdiversity Academy, where we will be developing an expertise on how to make university education more inclusive and try to connect that also with actual education. So many of us are, have long histories in doing research on superdiversity or doing research on education. And here we try to connect it with developing models of practice. So not only doing research, but also changing our universities. Thing is city labs, UNIC city labs, to try to bring the knowledge that we are developing and to connect that systematically with the city, the other way around. So bring the post-industrial transitions, the post-industrial challenges that our cities are facing, bring them back into our universities and let our students study them, research them, and develop them in the context of UNIC. So those are the three main lines of activities that everybody can expect from us in the coming years. So I would like to conclude at that point. I'll make you aware that this is the first seminar. You can expect more seminars in the almost on a monthly basis within UNIC on topics that are close to these topics that we've just discussed. So it can be about cities. There will be one session about the role of universities in post-industrial. It can be about superdiversity as today, and other topics will be discussed as well in our seminars. And I want to thank Kutch University for leading the way on our first seminar. And now, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Ahmet to start our first dialogue started on such a core topic for UNIC European University. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter, for this introduction about some details of the UNIC. Actually, you nicely summarize what we will do in the next 3 years. Let me now quickly move to our panel on superdiversity and inclusion in higher education. But before inviting our panelists, let me provide a brief background information that frames what we aimed at having this webinar. One of the main pillars of the UNIC, as Peter mentioned, that to establish the Superdiversity Academy, which aims at enhancing inclusion in our university environments. In fact, this event, this webinar today, is a type of launching event to mark the establishment of the Superdiversity Academy of UNIC. This concept of the superdiversity is very central to the larger context of UNIC, with the argument that the population of our cities and our universities are becoming very diverse, super diverse, particularly when we consider the various characteristics of the individual members of the universities, students, faculty members, researchers, administrative staff, with their ethnicity, race, gender, sexuality, culture, religion, social status, socioeconomic status, legal status, lifestyles, and many other aspects. We have also, as Peter mentioned, that we have increasing number of non-traditional students also in our universities. Throughout our activities in Superdiversity Academy in UNIC, we aimed at developing and applying an innovative model of super diverse teaching and learning. We will deal with the questions of how can we ensure that our classrooms and work environment at the universities could be sensitive enough to the needs of super diverse populations and how they can be truly inclusive. How can our university environments respect people from all diverse backgrounds, characteristics, and cultures? In this context, the Academy will map the current state of research on superdiversity and respective teaching practices at all 8 partner universities, and we will develop our knowledge and models of practice on superdiversity and inclusion. We strongly believe that our work in this work package in the next 3 years will significantly contribute to making our universities super diverse ready and providing a model for the inclusive universities. With this background, when we decided to organize this webinar, which is the first seminar of UNIC, we wanted to revisit the notion of super diversity and its connection with higher education. When the issue is on super diversity, of course, we cannot think of a better name than Steve Vertovec. We invited him as our keynote speaker, and we are honored that he accepted our invitation. Together with him, we have 2 other distinguished scholars who will be with us today. They are from the 2 partner universities of UNIC, Elena Tamaki of the University of Oulu and Sabine Severiens of the Erasmus University Rotterdam. I also like to express my thanks for them being with us. Just before inviting the Steve, two practical notes for the audience. First, end of the webinar, we will have the question and answer session, so you can write your questions to the chat box or the question answer part of the Zoom. Then our colleagues here, they will forward your questions to the panelists to the end of the session. Also, if you like to wish to ask your own questions, then you can raise the hands actually from the program, the Zoom. Then we will make you available that you can ask your own question to our panelists. Another small note, practical note, actually we are recording this webinar, but we will record the talks, but not the question and answer session. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Steve actually before to give his talk. As I said, I'm very happy and honored to have him with us. A very brief introduction. Many of us, of course, know him, but let me just have a kind of little introduction, reading just a short bio. He's the founding director of the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity, Göttingen, Germany. Previously, he was professor of transnational anthropology at Oxford University and director of Center on Migration Policy and Society, which is COMPAS. He's the author of five books, so many other, I think more than 35 volumes, and the numerous articles, of course, we know them. And Steve also has acted as expert on or consulted for numerous agencies, including UK Home Office, UK Department for International Development, British Council, the European Commission, the G8, World Bank, and the UNESCO. Let me also stress that the main concept of today, which is the superdiversity, which was coined by Steve in mid-2000s. So Steve, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks very much, Ahmet. Very nice introduction. Thanks also, Peter, for both of you for inviting me. I'm honored to be the first kickoff speaker for this whole series. It's no pressure. And I hope what I have to say is of use in helping UNIC shape things. Let me just share my screen if you bear with me a second. My talk, there you go. Presuming you can see that. Yeah, can I get a nod of head? Everyone can see that, presumably. Right, well, I'll aim to speak somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes, just some quick kickoff ideas and concepts. You know, the title of the webinar has to do with concepts and practices. So I'll just try to float some things out there, not just the superdiversity concept, but I want to talk more broadly about complexity and complexity thinking and what complexity thinking can bring to higher education. And I hasten to add, I don't know anything about higher education. Well, I mean, I've been professors in universities and so forth, but in terms of theory and administration and practice and strategy and all of those things at university level, I don't know. I'll have to defer to Sabine and Elina about that. And I hope things that I have to say don't run counter to what they're saying, but they're the experts, not me. But I want to talk broadly about some aspects of complexity. I see superdiversity as a mode of thinking about complexity. And I'm going to introduce the notion of the theory from social psychology about social identity complexity and how that fits together with superdiversity and what both of them might have to offer higher education. But again, these are just really kickoff ideas, and I'll look to Sabine and Elina and our general discussion to develop some of these things, especially in ways that UNIC might use it in the future. Okay, so obviously people will know that complexity theory is a massive field that really took off, I suppose, since the 1980s and 90s, particularly in physics and mathematics and other natural sciences. And it's been applied to many different things. Social scientists as well have tried to pick up aspects of complexity theory, to apply to different sorts of things, anything from voting behavior to behavior of crowds or riots, anything that a large number of pieces moving around, number of agents. And so, I mean, I've tried to educate myself, read up, talk to colleagues, participate in activities around complexity theory, because I think it does have something important to offer the age we live in now and that we're moving further into, and to what we can pick up as social scientists from complexity theory. And for me, what I've been able to gather boils down to these 3 points, and they relate directly to the superdiversity concept that I coined and have still been working with, as well as a number of other people. And so for me, we need to talk about complexity and ways to think about complexity when you have any kind of social system, let's say. Let's just stick to social science. A social system where, first of all, you have an increase in the number of agents or factors. So let's consider universities. There's a social system for you. So what happens when you simply have a sheer expansion of a university? You start to move into various complexity dynamics when you simply have an increase in the number of parts or agents. Also, when those parts or agents themselves have characteristics that are differentiating. And this is where the superdiversity stuff especially comes in. I'll come to that in the next slide. But you're having a simultaneously increase in numbers and an increase in the differentiation of characteristics of the people that comprise a social system. And then through various social dynamics, you have an increase of the interdependence between the people and their characteristics. Okay, and again, hopefully this will become clear when I talk superdiversity, but these are just 3 basic takeaways, I call them, out of complexity theory, that we have to be able to think about what happens in a particular system when these sorts of things increase. And again, learning from complexity theory, these sorts of increases lead to high contingency or uncertainty as to the development of any kind of system. Again, whether we're talking a biological system or a social system. When these things are increasing in these sorts of ways, number, differentiation, and interdependence, we can't be sure which direction it's developing, what process will occur. It's unpredictable. We talk about nonlinear trajectories. We can't base on our thought on what's happening to a system based on what we knew about it before, because it's inherently changed through these increases. Yet over time, new systems develop, what's called self-organization. All of these agents have sort of come to develop their own new mode of system dynamic, okay? All right, well, that's all very theoretical, but these are key ideas that also lie behind the idea of superdiversity. So let me turn to that and see if I can link these things together. So basically, I came up with the concept of superdiversity to try to point towards changes in data flows that I'd seen. This is back when I was at Oxford at Compass, and we were getting all kinds of data about migration flows to the UK over the last 30 years. And I noticed that there were some fundamental major changes going on with the people who are migrating to the UK. UK, like most countries, used to have large numbers of people coming from a few places and arriving in the UK. Same goes for Germany or France or Holland or Belgium, other places. You used to have mainly people coming from a few countries in large numbers. But over the past 30 years, we've seen small numbers of people coming from many different places, a real diversification of migration flows, and not just a diversification of places of origin, but all these other characteristics of migrants coming. Ethnicities, languages, religions, age profiles, gender profiles, legal statuses, skills and human capital are much more complex now than they were 30 years ago. And this can be demonstrated by all sorts of data that I can't get into for this presentation. But that's the whole basic idea. It's created conditions of superdiversity, the super here meaning that it's a type or level of diversity and complexity that supersedes what was there more than 30 years ago. So we know that the UK or Netherlands or Germany had a certain kind of diversity 30 years ago. And these new waves of migration with these divergent combinations of all those sorts of factors have mixed with that old diversity and produced a super diversity, a more complex social system than existed before. So it's, again, it had that element of increase in numbers, increase of differentiation of characteristics, and increase of the way that these characteristics fit together, because flows to certain countries became dominated by particular age, gender, and ethnicity and language profiles, human skills profiles, and so forth. And so it really was a complexification of global migration flows. And so this created conditions of superdiversity in the arrival destination. So this is the one slide that kind of puts it all together, the flows and the outcomes. So the basic idea with superdiversity coming out of migration-driven diversification is that over the past 30 years, we've seen more and more, and have the data to show it, that migrants are increasingly channeled in different ways. I often talk about global migration now as a great sorting system. Yeah, it's like the sorting hat in Harry Potter or something, and people know that people get sorted in moving for a variety of reasons, a variety of migration drivers, which themselves are complex systems. We see different combinations, again, of country of origin, migration streams. So here we're talking about labor migration, high-skilled labor migration, asylum seekers and refugees, family migration, student migration, all those major kinds of streams, and multiple legal statuses that go along with those, together with age, gender, human capital, all those sorts of things, again, determine how people are sorted out in the global migration system. And when they then arrive in the Netherlands, in Germany, in the USA, in Canada, wherever, they are already sort of pre-sorted and arrive in certain social positions, socioeconomic hierarchies already, into a stratification system that are largely marked by their legal status and this combination of factors, gender, country of origin, language, and so forth, okay? So migration instantly turns into this sorting system, which is at the same time a stratification system. So migrants arrive in very different social positions depending on this combination of factors. And this array, when you put them all together, all the people arriving with different characteristics being inserted into society in different points of the stratification system, you have very different national and urban configurations. You have super diverse configurations in cities and neighborhoods and universities. And all of those have a lot to do with integration and exclusion, conflict, conviviality, privilege, precarity. So super diversity, I just want to emphasize here, is not just about, as some people have misread it, it's not just about more ethnic groups and more nationalities. The whole point is to get away from looking at ethnicity or country of origin as the only thing that determines social status amongst migrants. It's a whole combination of factors. So at once, superdiversity is this thing about multiple characteristics and social stratification in this complex configuration. That's why I like this puzzle at the bottom of the screen. It's a layered puzzle of lots of different pieces, and different pieces are inserted into different levels with different kinds of diversity. So that's, I hope that you get the sense of the complexity of superdiversity. It's multiple characteristics and multiple social stratification positions. Okay, I'm going to add complexity to complexity now as I move towards trying to say something about universities. Now, another mode of complexity that I've gotten very interested in because it very much relates to superdiversity. So again, remember that for the individuals that we're talking about, the migrants and their families over multiple generations, again, we're talking about people like all of us. All of us have multiple group belongings, multiple categorical belongings, yeah? So for instance, just to exemplify, I just jotted down a number of things, I suppose person I know best, me, you know, I'm baby boom generation, married, American British citizenship, permanent resident in Germany with a work permit, white, male, heterosexual, able-bodied, father, high education, upper middle class, English mother tongue, middling German skills, although that's probably a matter of opinion if you talk to a German. Living in a mixed residential neighborhood, no institutional religion, but with Catholic upbringing. So for me, you know, I recognize, you know, just some of those categories that I belong to. And with social identity complexity theory in social psychology, led particularly by Marilyn Brewer, who you see here, she was one of the real kind of key figures in it, but now it's a major body of theory in social psychology. The idea is that the more people can be aware of the complexity of their own self categories, like I just outlined, not just what categories I belong to, but what's the relationship between all those categories that I just listed. Some are dependent on one another. Some might be in conflict. Some might have developed over the years. Some I might have only recently acquired. To be introspective about all the categories that I belong to, then they would say that I would have a high awareness of my own social identity complexity. Now, the interesting thing is, okay, that's kind of taken for granted. We all know we belong, we have multiple identities and all those sorts of things. But what experimental work in social psychology shows, the more people can become aware of their own superdiversity, let's call it. All of these categories which have combined, including class and social status and residency, as well as the usuals, gender, ethnicity, language, etc. The more people are aware of their own social identity complexity, experimental work shows the more positive they have, or the greater ability they have to recognize social identity complexity in others. That is, to not treat people as just belonging to one or another box that we often tend to put people in. Yeah. We see a white Eastern European male or a Muslim woman in a headscarf, and that's the sheer way that we approach people, through minimal categories, rather than recognizing the social identity complexity in others. So they show that, again, the more we're aware of this in ourselves, the more we can recognize it in others, and positive intergroup perceptions and attitudes flow from that. And this is demonstrated in experimental work. And I find that really interesting and very relevant, I hope you'll see it too, to superdiversity, because we have more and more of these characteristics and more social complexity in our societies, our neighborhoods, and in our universities. And so how can we make relations, perceptions, and attitudes better? Well, possibly by trying to get people to recognize their own social identity complexities and those of others a lot more. So last couple of slides, I don't know if I'm coming up probably on my 20 minutes or something. Again, I don't know anything about higher education and diversity. I know that it's certainly been around for a long time, because I lived and worked in the UK long enough, you know, way back when multicultural education was a huge field in itself and just developing in the 80s and 90s. Okay, so things have been around. Now it's about diversity is the catchword more than multiculturalism. So just to prepare for this lecture and to see what I might be getting myself into, I just looked around and I saw, for instance, that there is a thing, for instance, the Journal of Diversity in Higher Education. This is a journal of the American Psychological Association. So I think it's fairly prominent. Elena's, you know, nodding and so forth. So obviously, you know, specialists know about this. And I don't know where it's ranked in the field, but if it's American Psychological Association, it must be a kind of major one. And here, the mission statement for the journal is to look at experiences and outcomes of individuals from underrepresented and underserved communities, focusing on institutional barriers and challenges, patterns of access and achievement, and the impact of engaging with diverse students, faculty, and administrators. And I would want to add, like Ahmet was saying earlier, we have to look at all the support staff, all the gardeners and the cooking ladies and the cleaners and everybody. They are parts of the university too. Anyways, so I looked through the past, say, 5 years of this journal, 4 issues a year, to see what sort of things they covered. And indeed, it covers a number of things as diversity. There are articles about the experiences or barriers or whatever of disabled students, transgender students, lesbian and gay students, students with criminal records. So that's quite interesting take on diversity. Students with ideological diversity, which can mean many different things. So I thought that's interesting. And of course, intersectionality, which is a hugely important concept also for all these things I'm talking about, including social identity complexity. There are a number of articles that look at students who are both queer and disabled, or both queer and a person of color, and so forth. So, there is quite an array of things. But being an American journal, I would say that it seemed to me 70 to 80% of the articles were just about race. And then we can get into a whole discussion of what diversity means in different countries, because in the US, diversity as a concept is dominated by race. And I'm not putting that down or anything. We have to realize that diversity is what they call a floating signifier. It can mean different things to different people in different places. But nevertheless, I would say that, as highly respected as this journal is and highly interesting and important as the articles are, I wouldn't say we're getting to complexity as I'm talking about it by way of superdiversity and social identity complexity. So that's where I suggest higher education needs to go. There's all this good and important work being done here, but how can we make it even more complex to address what's happening to our societies and student bodies and so forth. So this is my last slide where I'm really skating out on thin ice, not really knowing what I'm talking about, but I'll just float it out there. For me, how to combine superdiversity in higher education would somehow within the university to create a context through promotional materials, through the curriculum itself, through guidelines or other sorts of programs to students and staff, how to recognize and value social complexities, superdiversity within the university community, and also within each individual who comprises the community. So not just to look at boxes and so forth around the place, but to recognize that everybody on campus has this social identity complexity array, much of it arising out of migration over the last 30 years, some of it not, or some of it more long-standing, maybe over the last 100 years or something. And how to create that context and combine it with what I would call sensitive opportunities for contact, for people to meet by way of their multiple identities, their multiple categories. And I call sensitive opportunities because let's face it, and we've done some work here and I've looked at the literature on events that are created to promote diversity and to promote contact. And they're all well-meaning and most of them very successful, but sometimes they are staged in such a way that they are kind of immediately privileging one group over another, or that some people are less comfortable in that opportunity for contact. And I'll just end with this example. Years ago, I was doing research in Northern England and in some schools, and the teachers were very upset that at parent-teachers meetings, working class white British parents and Muslim Asian British parents did not come to parent-teachers meetings. And it became quite clear it's because the parent-teachers meetings were framed in a very white middle-class sort of way that made other people uncomfortable being there because it wasn't their habitus, it wasn't their sense of practices. So it was an opportunity for contact that failed because it wasn't quite sensitive to others. And I've read other diversity programs that have had similar problems. So I think that has to be borne in mind when developing opportunities for contact within universities as well. So anyways, I better stop there. Those are just my ideas floating out there. I hope some of the concepts I've floated might be of use, and I'll look forward to discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Steve. This was really a thought-provoking talk. We have with your talk, we have revisited the notion of superdiversity in the context of social complexity. I mean, although you said that you know little about the higher education, but particularly in your conclusion and through your talk, you provided us with a very rich background to get connected to hold this discussion on super diversity and inclusion to the issues of in higher education. And I believe that our next two speakers also, their talk will be quite complementary to what you said. I'm sure they will connect to this higher educational part. So now I'd like to move to our second guest, Professor Elena Lehtomaki. She's a professor of global education at University of Oulu and leads the research team on education, diversity and globalization and ethics. Actually, her research interests focus on the social meaning of education, global education and learning, responsibility and internationalization of higher education, culturally responsive education and social inclusion. She has worked with international agencies and she's a member of the academic network for global education and learning and the founding member of the Finnish Global Education Research Network. Yes, Elena, I'd like to invite you now to give your talk.
Thank you very much for this great opportunity. And I think it would be very nice to refer to, Steve, your talk. Also, thank you for the super complexity and super diversity. And I think my main question here is then that how do we then, why do we talk about super diversity? And what could that mean then in super inclusion in higher education and how we sort of challenge ourselves as higher education institutions. And I would like to draw our attention also to reinventing the bicycle again, because that's possible. I was just recently reading a very interesting article on bicycles, how bicycles can be reinvented, and there's been a new mountain sort of bike and things like that, using new technology, airplane technology. And I think we can now use the airplane technology in terms of super diversity in the context of higher education and inclusion, because inclusion is a challenge, as you, Steve, mentioned. It is not something simplified to do. And I know that Sabine will now later on talk about more the pedagogical issues and dimensions. And I would like to have more sort of the educational sociological perspective into the issue. And I also want to point out that the European Union, European University Association has produced a document 2 years ago in 2019 on diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education. So that's a very recent sort of universities network. So we essentially don't have to reinvent everything again, but we can revisit what are the barriers they identified in European higher education institutions. It was a network of European higher education institutions, and we can sort of draw on from their work, and they identified barriers and I think indicators also what universities themselves identified in Europe. My background has been very much in inclusion and social inclusion, and from that we do understand that we sometimes need to categorize people in order to understand how to respond. And instead of sort of maybe the identity issue, I would also like to extend our thinking to the responsiveness of institution inclusion, or inclusion in general. With a did look at, what is inclusion? How do we conceptualize inclusion? And what do we mean by that? And we essentially have to look at also the institution's capabilities, if you would like to use Amartya Sen's terminology, on capabilities, which means that we understand higher education institutions as social spaces. Behind my, or you can see my background picture, which is from the University of Oulu, one space where students can meet or staff can meet and socialize. But when we look at then integration of migrants, in a recent project here in Finland, we did identify that we don't recognize the competencies in a sufficient way. And that comes back to us as higher education institutions. How do we recognize competencies? Not only, could I say, some shortage how do we recognize individuals, but then how do we respond to the expectations? And what this means to me from the institutional responsiveness perspective, it means that we need to sort of revisit who are our students, who are our staff, who are they? And identities help us in that way. And then another thing is then to revisit also, how do we respond? What are the issues we can do? A recent report in Finland also informs us that our international students, students who come with what we would call students from outside Finland, and even students from outside Europe, are challenged by the language issues. Our medium of instruction is Finnish or Swedish, too seldom Sami, which is one of the indigenous languages in the country. Too seldom do we have interpretation, too seldom do we manage to communicate in two languages. Another issue that creates inequalities, Student Union has complained about fees that have been introduced for non-European students with non-European backgrounds, which may further sort of make our student selections biased, because people do need to have the funding in order to come to the country. So how international are we then is the question with our internationalization efforts, and how well do we then respond to the diversity and super diversity, and how well do we analyze, you know, what is our current freedoms to study in creating and recognizing the agency of students. And my research has focused very much on students' voice and students' agency, students' freedom to function. And in the Nordic comparison, what we did identify was also that students feel that they don't have a voice when it comes to mobility, for instance. And that challenges us as a higher education institutions in the Nordic countries. That means 5 countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, and Iceland. And we could find that universities failed to introduce programs that would attract more students for mobility. And now that European universities are facing the new era because of COVID, COVID has sort of pushed us to look at virtual exchange mobilities, virtual cooperation, virtual projects, and all these kind of things. And I think UNIC offers an excellent opportunity for that, exercising also our responsiveness to super diversity through virtual modalities of learning, while we need to understand also the challenges that these are created. And this is, I think, where we need to look at what are the demographies we have, who are the groups, as in the US, we would call them underrepresented or non-traditional to some terms, while we can also talk about exclusion, marginalization. How brave are we then to respond, for instance, to experiences of racism? And to our surprise, Finland, which excels in education, we have the highest rate of experienced racism in the country. And if this happens in the country, how responsive is our higher education sector then when it comes to racism? And recent publications also do talk about anti-racism efforts within higher education. And then on the other hand, racialization, where people are, as Steve, you mentioned very clearly, that people are sort of labeled on the basis of something that is apparent instead of recognizing the competencies, recognizing the expectations, which do require interaction with the students, representation, but also checking who is representing, how representative are the representatives of different groups. And the challenge we see in super diversity in higher education, when we were going through the state of the art report that we're still working on, I think one of the issues is that, you know, we have the categories, and the challenge with categories is that we may easily label and sort of expect that these are the expectations and needs of the students if we don't include their voice. And the same, of course, concerns our staff as well in higher education. And these are some of the things that we have looked at, you know, what can we do as higher education institutions? And I think UNIC offers us now this cooperation, I think, really to challenge these terms that, you know, what is super diversity? How could we become super inclusive, but maybe that's too much. Becoming inclusive, and that concerns all these aspects when it comes to, we talk about structures, we talk about programs, we talk about curricula, and we talk about fees, we talk about finances. And one dimension that is most challenging, I think, for higher education institutions is politics. Higher education, sort of the representation and participation when it comes to designing of programs, designing of aims, designing of participation. And of course, from the inclusion perspective, we need to look at also the access, as we often to working life, and finding meaningful opportunities. And one of the issues I think we need to also recognize very clearly is that when we talk about superdiversity, intersections are there, and there are sort of many multiple things, as you mentioned, and then overarching things, multiple things, and then things can be more complex. But I think we are higher education institutions, we are working in higher education institutions, so we need to collaborate. And I think collaboration, interaction are key in these issues. And then how can we do that? These are the things and goals we have set for our work as the UNIC Superdiversity Academy members. And we do know from previous research that inclusion or diversity, equity, and inclusion are not contradictory in that term, in terms of quality. Instead of that, we do know that quality is their preconditions for quality of our higher education institutions' functions. And the preconditions, I think, is something we need to sort of check. And how do we do with these sort of matters as preconditions of quality in our teaching and learning and societal interaction? Because essentially we collaborate. And as Stephen mentioned clearly, that demographies are changing in society, they're changing in higher education institutions. And then I think the mutual learning across different stakeholders, the cities, universities, and working life, and then UNIC, bringing these sort of successes and good stories to UNIC cooperation, I think is very important. So barriers are there. Barriers have been identified by the European University Association through their collaborative project. And I think we can go now one step further and then look at what can we do and how can we respond. And that requires also commitment from the policy level, leadership, representation of students and staff, and sort of self-assessment by the universities. Also, what is it that we do, what we have done and what we haven't done. And then in a way, yes, we can reinvent the bicycle again. But we don't have to go and look at the small parts. We can look at the system, how it functions. And I think this is what we can essentially do through UNIC cooperation. So I think it's great to have the superdiversity term challenging us and then looking at what does inclusion mean and in what dimensions. But I would like to leave now room for Sabine to talk about the pedagogical part, which I think is very important. But I would like to draw the attention to our leadership and also to our policy level and politics of education as well. And what is it that we are responsible for as higher education institutions? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elena. I mean, just you referred to various diverse perspectives. Thank you also, you referred to the state of the art report. I mean, just still we are writing. And also you referred to some points of what the Steve told us. So this will create, I'm sure, that the kind of discussion point, a series of the discussion point. Now we can move to our last contributors, Professor Sabine Severiens from the University of Erasmus University, Rotterdam. She is Professor of Educational Sciences at the Pedagogical and Educational Sciences. The main theme in her research is diversity and educational inequality from the perspective of the teacher as well as the student. One of the focal points in her current work is teaching in classrooms with students from diverse backgrounds and strengthening professional capacity in this particular area. Yes, Sabine, now floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you, Ahmet, and also, of course, the leaders of the UNIC network for inviting me to give this talk. It's an honor to be able to present in this first webinar. Let me start sharing my screen. I prepared a PowerPoint. Okay, there it is. Well, thank you also, Stephen, as well as Elina, for your presentations. Well, you've been asking a lot of very interesting questions, Elina, that I think are important to answer. And it resonates also with how I think about this, and also with my talk, especially the question, what can we do? I think it is on all levels in higher education is very important to answer. Okay, so I will be talking a little bit more about the pedagogy, so the teaching in super diverse classrooms. First of all, of course, the question, why should we talk about this at all? I think probably this audience it's not so necessary to answer this question. I'm assuming that you all, well, that you all know why we should talk about this, but I think it's still important to mention that, yeah, the very persistent differences in sense of belonging that our students from diverse backgrounds experience, as well as the very persistent differences in achievement that are still related to background characteristics, I mean, this should create a sense of urgency, I think, among all of the university staff to talk about this and to think about, okay, why are these differences so persistent, and how can we change this? And in my research work, I pose this question many times. I talk about this with teachers, with my colleagues, but also with teachers in primary and secondary education. Because of course, in fact, this is not something that starts to happen in university. This is already apparent in primary education and sort of continues to secondary and also to universities. This is, you know, it's in the whole educational pipeline. You see these differences. So I talk about this question a lot with teachers, especially, and school leaders. And then generally, what you hear is, you can sort of, when you talk about this, you hear people explaining the differences, basically mostly in terms of factors outside of education. And in a good psychological theory term, most teachers make external attributions. So this means that generally they think, okay, we see these differences because of factors to do with the student, with the background of the student, because in primary education, for example, because the parents didn't read enough with the students, or because the students are not so motivated, or because of their language deficits. This is generally what teachers do when I talk with them about why are there still so many differences in achievement, for example. But sometimes I do hear teachers also talk about factors in education. So they sometimes do make an internal attribution. Like Elina, you just did, you know, we should think about what we do. I think this is very true, but I hear it very seldomly. Teachers do not regularly say, okay, it may have to do with the way I teach, or because I do not know so well how to connect with students that are different from myself. And I think this is important to move towards the internal attribution side of the explanation, because that, I think, will open up possibilities for change. And well, a while ago, Christine Sleeter, she wrote a beautiful article on using critical race theory and relating it to the whiteness of teacher education. And she concludes that generally white teachers, which is it's the majority by far of our teaching staff, they do not see themselves as part of the problem. And this is true in primary and secondary education, but I think it's also true in higher education. Well, I mean, yeah, where most of the teachers do not really feel responsible for these differences, and they do not really feel it necessary that a diverse or a super diverse student body needs a different way of teaching. So yeah, it is important to move to that and to start thinking about it in that way. And I always find, okay, so one of the, for me, very, it's an inspiration, James Banks. You could describe him perhaps as the godfather of multicultural education. And he has been around for quite a while, but I think his work is still has a lot to offer if you want to move to thinking about, okay, what should we do as teachers and as people organizing education. Of course, his work is very extensive. He writes about many conditions that should be in place, and also what to do when you want to move towards implementation. And I don't want to discuss this all because then my talk would last forever. But I do want to talk about it a little bit more, two topics in his work. In his one condition, which is related to diversity beliefs, and the other one is referring to culturally responsive teaching, which is, I think, has a lot to offer when you think about teaching in super diverse classrooms. So first, the diversity beliefs. Then, if you think about, okay, what kind of beliefs are there, or how can you think about diversity from a perspective of as a teacher? Then I like the work of Hagveld and her colleagues. She's also based in Berlin. She describes different two basic different ways of thinking about diversity, and one is the multicultural way, the multicultural view, and the other one is the egalitarian view. Now, just to explain it a little bit, the multicultural view would basically focuses a bit more on the differences between groups in your classroom. So as a teacher, you would then think about, okay, so how do my students differ? On what kind of dimensions do they differ? And what does that mean for their learning? And on the other hand, the egalitarian view would be more thinking in terms of diversity, but then more focusing on the similarities between groups. So what connects them? Where are they similar? They have similar views in terms of their religious backgrounds, or in terms of interests, or it can be any dimension of diversity, basically. So this is a nice, this is a very useful tool I have found when you talk with teachers about diversity and how do they actually feel about diversity and how do they view it. I can also say that, though, that both kinds of dimensions, they also have a downside, I would say. Wait, this way. With the egalitarian view, for example, I mean, it's, of course, it's a very appealing way of thinking about diversity, is that you should first and foremost think about the similarities. But if you take it too far, I think, so to speak, just around the corner could also be the color blindness and the fact that it's only about the similarities, as if people don't differ, because they do, obviously. And the result can also be that if teachers only focus on similarities, that some of the students, and of course, especially the students that have a different background than the teacher, might feel that they are invisible, or that their background doesn't matter, as if they don't, as if it doesn't, yeah, as if they are not allowed to talk about it. So this would be a downside if you take the egalitarian view a bit too far. But this is also, you can say something like that about the multicultural view. Of course, if you talk about diversity and differences between groups, and if you really highlight that, of course, if you take that too far, then yeah, it becomes possible that there will be the stigma and the stereotypes will surface and will start playing a too dominant role. So in that sense, I think, yeah, like I said, this tool is helpful in talking about diversity, and also, and without really pointing out in the sense that, oh, you have the wrong view, but I have the right view. You know, it doesn't go that way. It really is appealing to me because both views obviously have their positive sides as well. Well, Geneva Gay is well, maybe I should call her the godmother of cultural responsive teaching. She also works a lot with James Banks. And she also talks about this focus on differences and similarities at the same time. She really makes a point of that, is that of course there are differences, you should talk about it, but you should also focus on similarities. So it's trying to find a balance between these two, so that all groups in your classrooms have a voice without emphasizing the differences, but also without avoiding or ignoring differences. And also especially the funds of knowledge concept that she uses, I really like. For her, it's important to, if you teach, really start from the funds of knowledge and the experiences that students bring to the classroom. That's all, should always be your starting point as a good teacher. And this requires you to really get to know your students. Who are your students? And I also heard Elina just asking this question. It is important. Who are your students? Where do they come from? What is important to them? And then that should, if you design a class or a course, that is always your starting point. And then the next thing that culturally responsive teaching asks you to do is come up with work formats, come up with a way of teaching and pedagogy that that can address or can support different students in different ways. So variation, differentiation is very important. So that more traditional way of teaching in higher education, with one teacher just sort of talking and all students listening, I mean, you can do that every now and then, but also try to have collaborative working and have them go outside and try different things, because people learn in different ways, given their different backgrounds. But of course, this is this is not an easy thing to do. A super diverse classroom where all students, basically all students, are unsimilar to yourself requires something of the teacher. It is not an easy job. And of course, we should also think about how do we prepare our staff, our teaching staff, to actually do this. This is true for higher education, but also, of course, for teacher training for primary and secondary education. And I just would like to share with you just quickly two results. I am involved in the OECD study TALIS, which is a big study on teachers and on teaching. And well, one of the questions that we asked in the 2018 round was, how well prepared are you for teaching in multilingual and multicultural settings? Because of course this is important, as we have been, the diversity has been growing, so this is important to think about. So here is a huge graph, because well, obviously many countries have participated. Unfortunately, the UNIC countries, let me see, Germany and Ireland, I'm so sorry, but obviously you didn't participate, so I cannot show your results. But the other 6 countries in UNIC have been participating. And this is an interesting graph, I think. You see, Finland is at the bottom of the UNIC countries, in stating that I think a bit more, yeah, but 15% of your teachers feel well prepared or very well prepared. Only 15%. So I think, yeah, there is some work to do for your teacher training institutes. But obviously, this is also true for Belgium and the Netherlands. It's only a bit more. Croatia has 20%, and Spain and especially Turkey seem to be doing a much better job in preparing their students for teaching in these kinds of classrooms. And yeah, so here I think you see a really good opportunity for UNIC to talk about this. So what is happening in Turkey and Spain that, well, the other countries can learn from? Of course, this is about teacher training, but also about professional development. There is another recent review that is very interesting in terms of its results. So how, after teacher training, how do you train, you know, how do you have teachers develop yeah, these diversity practices in professional development courses? And well, first of all, they also conclude that most teachers really feel underprepared. But also, when you look at the effects and the processes in professional development, you see one big thing is that there is a lot of resistance. And I think we should never underestimate this level among general groups of teachers. And I mean, this is about primary and secondary education, but I think probably this is also true for higher education. And I've also experienced it in a lot of my own work. It is not easy to talk about diversity, super diversity, and have teachers adapt their teaching practices because of this resistance. It's a topic that is very close to their hearts. It's close to their identity, and it's very sensitive. What they also notice that there's a lot of colorblind perspective. So teachers do have a tendency to emphasize similarities and to think that it's not really relevant. The ethnic cultural background or other dimensions of diversity are not really relevant for learning. Then you have a lot of teachers who say, yeah, but my discipline is a neutral discipline, or it's not really suited for culturally responsive teaching. And this also doesn't help to develop these kinds of strategies. And then finally, what they also conclude, what they have seen in the review, is that in many programs, teachers argue that no, we should first, try to increase achievement, and then we can maybe talk about multicultural education. This is a very strong view among many teachers, that it's as if that has nothing to do with each other. They don't see multicultural education as a means to increase achievement. And this is as professional developers is what we are dealing with. And I think in the Superdiversity Academy, if you aim to make universities more inclusive and invite teachers to become more inclusive teachers, yeah, you also need to answer these kinds of views that are very strong in many teachers. Well, then this second result, and this will be the final result I'd like to share, is also very alarming in a way, I would say. So this is the percentage of teachers reporting a high level of need for professional development in teaching in multicultural or multilingual settings. So here again are the UNIC countries. Well, I'm a little bit ashamed of this, but the Netherlands is at the bottom, and it's even more shameful because in the last Thalys round in 2014, we were also at the bottom. So apparently Dutch teachers have no need for developing in this area. So there you go. This is what we are dealing with. But also, yeah, Finland and Belgium again are at the bottom of the graph. Croatia is somewhere in the middle. So they have 15% teachers feeling that, okay, I could need something here to develop here. And Spain and Turkey again is highest. So these are interesting results, I think. So in Turkey, apparently they feel relatively well prepared, and still they have a need. So somewhere there is, we should talk about in UNIC, I think, about the explanation for this. But I think it's insightful. So finally, to conclude, I would say we need to start making more internal attributions as to the causes, and have our colleagues join us there, and talk about beliefs. It can be helpful, superdiversity beliefs, because I think we don't talk about it often enough. It's important to talk about it, and also about the consequences for teaching and learning in higher education. And then, from that point onwards, and I think UNIC offers a good opportunity, start developing professional development that is suited for your kind of superdiversity in your specific institution. And I think collaboration with other universities is very helpful and insightful. So, Ahmet, thank you for your attention, and everyone, of course. I will stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Sabine. Really, just you touch upon some real questions of this diversity issues in teaching in higher education. When I follow these three talks, they were really complementary to each other, and also you refer to each other. We have heard the three great talks by Steve, Elena, and Sabine. From Steve, actually, we have heard a kind of a theoretical and analytical framework on superdiversity, and putting it in relation to the social complexities. And also he referred to some real, at the end of his talk, some real questions. But also Elena and Sabine provided us with some practical perspectives, particularly linking the debate to the higher education. I really learned a lot. I enjoyed the talks. Now I should remind all of us, actually, we have an audience of the 154 people around here. It shows that we have great interest to the topic. Now we can go to the end of some stage. I like to give some words, just to the three panelists, actually 3 or 5 minutes, just because they refer to each other and they exchange views. But before that, from the audience, I can see there are some questions, or possibly also I should again remind the audience that they can ask questions through this question and answer part of the Zoom, plus there's a chat box. Or if you like to ask question yourself, also you raise your hand and we'll make you available. You can just ask your own question. So maybe my colleagues, they can help me actually just reading those questions. Burcu, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay, maybe if you can go, one by one, just through the questions and also the questions, just who is asking to whom? Okay, floor is yours.
And before we pass to the Q&A session, as we're going to stop the recording, we'd like to thank everyone for participating in this conference. For